In the shadow of the war between Ukraine and Russia, the main focus is now shifting towards the Mediterranean with the removal of the regime in Syria. Russia is in danger of losing much of its power in the Mediterranean. The West, particularly the United Kingdom, is expanding its preparations to counter Russia's tendencies to reassert itself as an authoritarian power in the Mediterranean after the civil unrest in Syria. This is because Russia will want to refocus on the Mediterranean and Africa to provide economic resources for the Ukraine war, but the UK's military power in Cyprus seems to be a deterrent to Russia, which has already lost its power in Syria from such ambitions. We will now take a deeper look at Russia's new desired Mediterranean course, how the UK is trying to thwart Putin's plans through Cyprus, and how the Kremlin is losing ground most recently by withdrawing its military forces from Syria. Before we start, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and give us a like to stay up to date with our content. Let's start with the UK's blockade of the Mediterranean route that Russia is trying to re-establish. Around 700 armed forces personnel are deploying to the RAF base in Cyprus to support the UK government's contingency planning, including Foreign Office and Home Office staff and Border Force officers. They join hundreds of troops already stationed on the island, where the UK has had two armed forces bases for more than 60 years. The UK's permanent military presence in the Middle East gives it a range of capabilities, particularly in the Mediterranean, including having previously conducted evacuation missions. Currently, the UK has two military bases on the island of Cyprus. In 1960, when Cyprus gained independence from the United Kingdom, as part of the treaty, the UK retained two sovereign base areas at Actiaia in the southwest of the island and Delia in the southeast. The Actia base is currently in the spotlight as it is home to the RAF fleet. In addition to the approximately 700 troops sent to RAF Actia, the base already has a large number of troops deployed. Aircraft based there include RAF Typhoons and Puma helicopters. There are also two British warships in the area which could be used against Russia if an evacuation or defense operation is ordered. Border Force and Foreign Office officials can also support the military. This UK military force in Cyprus has been on alert because of the problems in the Middle East, but in the wake of the recent events in Syria, these forces could also serve to prevent Russia's efforts to regain control of the Mediterranean and African routes. The West does not want Russia to gain economic interest in the Mediterranean in the wake of the Ukraine war. Therefore, as part of NATO doctrine, the UK could act to guarantee security against a surprise Russian move in the Mediterranean. However, looking at the current situation, it seems unlikely that Russia would attempt such a move. Us and Libyan officials have reported that Russia has withdrawn advanced air defense systems and other sophisticated weapons from bases in Syria and shifted them to Libya as Moscow scrambles to maintain its military presence in the Middle East after the collapse of the Assad regime. In Damascus, Russian cargo planes have flown air defense equipment, including radars for the S-400, S-400, and S-300 interceptor systems from Syria to bases in eastern Libya controlled by Moscow-backed Khalifa Haftar. Officials confirmed Russia has also significantly reduced its presence in Syria, sending troops, military aircraft, and weapons out of Syria. The Syrian bases have been the cornerstone of Moscow's ability to project power in the Middle East and Africa. Serving as a hub for the flow of troops, mercenaries, and weapons, the naval base in Tartus has been the only supply and repair point for the Russian Navy in the Mediterranean. Now, Russia seems to be trying to use another former partner in Libya as a way to maintain its influence in the region and support a naval presence in the region where the US and other North Atlantic Treaty Organization members have bases and warships. Russia already has a presence in Libya, including the Wagner paramilitary group, which has close ties to Haftar, whose Libyan National Army controls the east of the war-torn country. Wagner fighters have used Har's facilities, including his airbase, as transit hubs to other African countries. Last year, senior Russian officials met with Haftar to discuss long-term docking rights at the ports of Benghazi or Tobruk, both less than 400 miles from Greece and Italy, as officials said at the time that Moscow was discussing whether to upgrade facilities in Brooke to accommodate Russian warships. Haftar has for years sought air defense systems from Russia to strengthen his control over the divided country, which has been riven by violence since a 2011 uprising toppled longtime dictator Muammar Gaddafi. Armed groups and foreign powers have vied for power ever since, with a civil war erupting in 2019. The country is divided between factions in the east and west. Russia's wing is trying to exploit this situation to regain its lost control of the Mediterranean and Africa. Russia's strategy in Libya is too dangerous to be underestimated. We can understand this danger more clearly by taking into account the relations that have taken place. So far, Russia was inclined to forge a deep alliance with Egypt to counter US efforts to control security in the Mediterranean, but as Moscow-Cairo relations deteriorated with Egypt's shift to the US camp, Russian attention shifted to Libya. From 2008 onwards, the Kremlin increasingly signed billion-dollar contracts for arms supplies and railway projects for more than 550 km between CTE and Benghazi, two strategic cities overlooking the Mediterranean. At the time, Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi offered then Russian President Dmitry Medvedev the port of Benghazi as a permanent Russian base as a counterweight to the United States. However, the Kremlin clearly reaped the most important benefits for a permanent North African Mediterranean forward. Base solved the problems associated with long-term out-of-region deployments. Despite the fall of the Gaddafi regime in 2011, Russia has not taken its eyes off Libya. This was evidenced by its excellent relations with the current leadership of Eastern Libya, which often flew to Moscow or hosted prominent personalities linked to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Apart from the economic benefits of circumventing sanctions for the invasion of Ukraine, the ultimate goal seemed to be to open a Russian front in the Mediterranean due to Libya's strategic location arm. Shipments from the Syrian port of Tartus to the port in Turk were increasing, and the Russian physical presence was reported to have reached around 800 troops distributed in military bases such as Al-Quruba, Al-Hadim, Jafare, and Tobruk. Mercenaries belonging to the so-called African Corps, possibly a revitalization of the Wagner paramilitary group by the Russian government, were deployed in the towns of Gabia and March. Some observers reported the establishment of a training camp near Benghazi. Russia was looking for a stable base in Libya. There were several reasons for this. Russian ships could dock in front of the European coast, while the airfields allowed the deployment of Russian air weapon systems. The most potentially disruptive factor concerned new war technologies, but an important distinction must be made if Russia's intention was to threaten NATO with any of these capabilities it posed more risk to Russia than to the Western alliance. This is because NATO forces would probably be able to disrupt Russian operations in short order if, as was more likely, these capabilities were intended to support Russian allies in North Africa and elsewhere on the African continent. That was a different problem. But as we have discussed, Russia has lost control in Africa, and its naval power in the Mediterranean has been decimated following the fall of the regime in Syria. So far, Russia has tried to increase its power in the Mediterranean through energy policies. Russia's efforts to overcome the oil sanctions related to Ukraine by selling oil through Libya were seen since 2022. The revenues have amounted to about $5 billion and flow to Russia. With the approval of Libyan Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar, this explains why Moscow has not yet collapsed. After more than 2 years of sanctions and isolation, Putin's strategy must now be interpreted with a broader view of the entire African continent and all the countries that have recently entered Russia's orbit. One of the main actors to pay attention to is Niger, until last year a key ally of the United States, where a $100 million military base has been built, allowing drones to take off a reconnaissance and targeted military operations across the Sahel. This base was in danger of falling under Moscow's control, as were some ports in Sudan vital for direct access to the Red Sea. Having an outpost in that region would give Moscow important strategic advantages. These examples were a harbinger of Russia's potential on a continent where sanctions and the demands of the international community, especially the United Nations, are difficult to enforce, and where local sentiments about the Russia-Ukraine war differ significantly from those in the US and Europe. These were details that the Kremlin did not lose sight of, and Putin made great use of them, especially starting with Libya. The Kremlin was pushing its own people, whether politicians, professional soldiers, or private military contractors, to the African coast bordering the Mediterranean Sea and many countries below the Maghreb in a kind of pincer maneuver. But in an almost unthinkable scenario, given current trends, the West reacted harshly to Russia's growing presence in Africa along the Mediterranean, making it difficult for Moscow to capitalize on it. But while Russia's attempts to spread propaganda and influence, control key resources, and exploit migration flows have been largely thwarted in the aftermath of events in Syria, the threats are far from over. Moscow may try to regain a foothold on the naval chessboard of the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. This is because Western countries do not seem ready to impose themselves in Africa to limit Russia's advances, and have failed to implement a containment strategy in countries like Libya, which has been decisive for the smuggling of arms, oil, rare materials, and migrants from the Sahel. France, which until recently had a leadership role in the Sahel, has been forced to abandon the entire region. This was also the case for the European UCAP mission. The U.S. military mission could face major challenges, as recently stated, aided by General Michael Langley, the commander of AFRICOM. Moreover, US interest seems to be shifting more towards China than Russia. Russia is seen as a lower-level competitor. This is because after the removal of the Syrian regime, Russia has less threatening forces and control structures in the Mediterranean and Africa. While this is true in absolute terms, the Kremlin can still do a lot of damage, as was clearly Demonstrated in Libya between 2019 and 2020, this possibility should not be underestimated. Fortunately, at this point, the UK and US naval presence in the Mediterranean is still standing firm against Russia's efforts to resurrect its lost power in the Mediterranean with Syria. When we look at the history of Russian strategy in the Mediterranean and the current state of affairs in terms of naval rivalry, there are, of course, elements that reassure the West. Russia has never had a Mediterranean fleet, even on paper, Russia's naval strategy has always been continental, and at best aimed at the northern seas and oceans. Control over the Mediterranean has often seemed out of reach. Russia's physical naval presence was limited to its Mediterranean fleet, the 5th Escadra, which had been there since 1958 while trying to promote Moscow's interests and influence relations with regional actors, with the caveat of the 1936 Montreux Convention, which gave Turkey control of the sea's entrance straits. Its primary goal was to build a naval contingent capable of rapid intervention in the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and the Black Sea were historically considered by many Russian elites as a single body of water. As the leading Black Sea power, then the Soviet Union had to extend its influence into the adjacent waters. Admiral Ivan Kanov, commander of the Black Sea Fleet in the early 1990s, argued in a speech to the crew of a submarine in Vor, Albania during the Soviet Navy's first extended deployment in the Mediterranean that even his sailors fully understood the importance of a naval presence in the Mediterranean. Ivan Kanether, Ane Kanet another, Admiral and Chief of Staff of the 5th Escadra from 1970 to 1973, stated that a naval presence in the Mediterranean was necessary to defend the interests of the motherland. Both officers reflected the doctrinal thinking of the main Soviet naval leader of the time, Fleet Admiral Sergei Gorkov. Gorkov's concepts of strategic mobility and forward deployment shaped the Soviet presence in the Mediterranean. Such aspirations were put into practice through a series of Cold War-era agreements with Mediterranean littoral states. In fact, in 1958, Albania opened the port. War to Soviet submarines, expanding Russian access to the Adriatic. This arrangement did not last long, however, and in 1961, the Soviet port was closed the total number of days. All Soviet ships spent in the Mediterranean dropped from 5,600 in 1960 to 2,300 in 1961 and 61 and 600 in 1963. The Soviets gained access to the ports of Alexandria, Marmaratru, and port in Egypt, and Latakia in Syria. By 1971, this new access had increased SSR's presence by 300%. However, this would be undermined by the deterioration of relations with Cairo under Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, who was even denied access to the port of Marmaratru when Russian ships were there. The Soviets lost their Egyptian ports for good in 1976. In Syria, they expanded as far as Tartus, a presence that persists to this day. But Syrian ports were then small, poorly equipped, and unsuitable for large ships or to support the expanded operations of the Russian Navy. They are still considered unsuitable for Russian ships, but this is no longer relevant for Russia. As we mentioned, the recent events in Syria have completely halted Russia's naval presence and control in the Mediterranean. All these moves took place under the UK's close supervision by the US. Unlike Russia, the US has always had a stable presence in the Mediterranean through the US 6th Fleet. This presence was ensured by the port bases of La Malena and Naples in Italy, Rota in Spain, and Crete in Greece. The UK wing through Cyprus has always provided peace in the Mediterranean as part of the NATO strategy, like the US against Russian and other threats. In short, although Russia is trying to regain its former power in the Mediterranean through Libya, the military deterrent forces of important NATO countries such as the UK, the US, and the region, as well as the Kremlin's forced withdrawal of almost all its military resources in Syria, are shattering Putin's dreams. The only reality now is that Russia is no longer a major power in the Mediterranean, but rather a country watching from the background. We have already mentioned that from a naval point of view, Russia has little chance of reversing this situation in the Mediterranean. Nevertheless, it is also a reality that the West needs to be constantly vigilant against Russia's Mediterranean strategies. Putin could secretly make an unexpected move in the Mediterranean to fund the war in Ukraine. This may seem unlikely, but when it comes to the Russian threat, everything can change at any moment in the Mediterranean. The NATO wing is probably aware of this, and that's why the International Military Alliance is likely to step up its security measures in the region in the coming time frame in order to prevent Putin from exploiting the Mediterranean and not to allow him to rekindle the flames of the war in Ukraine. The developments discussed highlight critical lessons about the evolving dynamics of global geopolitics and the balance of power in the Mediterranean and beyond. First, they underscore the importance of maintaining strong international alliances like NATO, which has consistently proven its ability to deter threats and stabilize regions through collective security measures. The strategic presence of NATO forces, particularly those of the UK and the US has been pivotal in countering Russia's attempts to reassert influence in the Mediterranean. It demonstrates that multilateral cooperation, when coupled with proactive defense strategies, can effectively neutralize emerging threats. Second, Russia's persistent efforts to find alternative ways to project power, despite setbacks in Syria and elsewhere, reveal the Kremlin's adaptability and determination to maintain relevance on the global stage. This is a reminder that while Russia's current position in the Mediterranean has diminished, the international community cannot afford complacency. Vigilance and continued investment in defense, infrastructure, and intelligence are essential to anticipate and counter potential threats. From a broader perspective, these events highlight the intersection of military, economic, and diplomatic strategies in shaping the future of international relations. Russia's use of energy resources, mercenaries, and proxy relationships demonstrates a multifaceted approach to influence that extends beyond traditional military operations. The lesson here is clear: addressing such challenges requires not only military preparedness, but also robust policies that integrate economic sanctions, diplomatic engagement, and regional partnerships. On a personal note, it is essential to view these developments with a balanced perspective. While Russia's actions are concerning, they also point to a broader truth about the interconnected nature of global security. What happens in one region, whether in the Mediterranean, the Middle East, or Africa, has far-reaching implications for the rest of the world. This underlines the need for responsible governance and international cooperation to address not only immediate threats, but also the root causes of instability, such as economic inequality, political corruption, and regional conflicts. As individuals, we must also recognize the role of informed citizenship in promoting global stability. Staying updated on these issues, supporting policies that advocate for peace, and fostering dialogue over conflict are small but significant ways to contribute. Ultimately, the lessons from the Mediterranean reaffirm a timeless truth that peace and security require constant effort, collaboration, and vigilance. These principles remain crucial as the world faces an increasingly complex and interconnected geopolitical landscape,